Kia ora koutou, and welcome everyone to our webinar for Adapting to Sea Level Rise for Rāpaki and Allandale. I am Crystal Anderson, an Engagement Advisor here at Council and your host for this webinar. Thank you for taking the time out to join us online tonight. So we'll start by covering some background on this program and what work has been done to date. We'll then move to some detail about the draft pathways for Rāpaki and then on to Allandale. We will pause for questions at the end of each section, so just feel free to pop those into the chat as you think of them. Just to note that we may not get to all the questions tonight, but we will respond to all questions in our Q&A doc, which we'll send out to you after the webinar. So first, I'll introduce you to the team behind the screen and let you know how you can participate during the session. I'll then hand over to our presenters who will run you through the presentation. So tonight you're going to be hearing from Tom, who is our Principal Advisor of Coastal Adaptation. You'll also be hearing from Ruby, who is our Senior Adaptation Advisor. And we also have Jane, the Team Leader of Coastal Adaptation, who will jump in for a wee bit and help us to answer some questions at the end of the session. So your mics and cameras are switched off so that we can keep the session moving, but you can ask questions in the Microsoft Teams chat, which is located at the top bar menu as a speech bubble. If you're not able to use this feature, you can email us questions, and you can email those to letstalk.ccc.govt.nz. If you're hard of hearing or you're experiencing sound issues, you can turn on live captions. Just click the three small dots above the More at the top of your Teams screen and click Turn on Live Captions down near the bottom of the drop-down list. One last thing from me, hopefully the banner came up to let you know that the session is being recorded. This recording will be shared on our YouTube channel in the next few days, and you'll receive a link via email showing you how to access this recording. I'll now hand over to Ruby to start the presentation.
Thanks, Crystal. Kia ora koutou. First, a big welcome from me and the rest of the team, and thank you for taking the time out to join us tonight. Hopefully it'll be interesting and the start of a good conversation. So I'm going to start by providing a bit of an overview, some background context to our program before I pass over to the rest of my team. So we know that as the climate warms, sea levels are going to rise. And as that happens, coastal hazards like coastal flooding, coastal erosion, and rising groundwater are more likely to impact our low-lying inland and coastal communities, particularly places where we've got things or people or places that we care about. Council is identifying these risks, and we're going to be working with communities right across the district to plan for how we can adapt to and manage these risks over time. Grab the next slide, Crystal. So MFE has provided councils with some guidance on how to undertake this kind of adaptation planning work. We took this guidance and we set out how we would apply it to our local context here in Christchurch and the Coastal Adaptation Framework. So that's the first little box on your screen there. This document, among other things, sets out 7 key guiding principles, particularly the decision to focus public funds on public assets. So if you want to read more about the Coastal Adaptation Framework, if you haven't seen that before, you can find that on our website, and maybe Crystal might be able to pop a link to that in the chat as well if you want to have a look at that. Already gone. Perfect. So check that out if you want more information. Adaptation planning is designed to be a really collaborative process between council and communities. To make this achievable, we've split up our district into different areas and made the decision to pilot our process in what we're calling the Whakaropo Lyttelton Harbour to Kokarata Port Levy Adaptation Area. We also pulled together a coastal panel, and so this is a group of community members who are taking a deep dive into the nitty-gritty of this work with us. On behalf of the wider community, with key kind of check-in points with you, the wider community, at points throughout the process. So The panel's quite a diverse group of community members. It includes 2 representatives from both Te Hapu o Ngāti Wheki and Te Urunga o Kokararata, as well as we've got youth, business interests, a representative from the local community board and water zone committee, alongside some wider city representatives as well. The panel are supported by a specialist and technical advisory group. So that's basically a pool of experts that we've brought together to bring expertise in a range of different areas. So we've got asset management experts that sit alongside representatives from places like DOC and public health and economists, for example. So one of the first things that the Coastal Panel did was look at how people, places, and things of value across the harbour were going to be vulnerable to coastal hazards over the next 30 years. We can't plan for every inch of the coastline all at once, so it was really important that we identified where we needed to focus our attention in the first place. So they identified the 6 priority adaptation locations that are pointed out on the map in the middle of the slide there. Rāpaki and Allandale are, of course, 2 of those priority locations, and they're the ones that we're going to be focusing on tonight. Cool. This timeline manages to roll up many years of work and many steps into kind of those 8 boxes. The key takeaway really is that this isn't the first conversation that we have had with the communities out in this area. It's also not going to be the last. We're kind of midway through. The Coastal Panel has spent the last year or so drafting up adaptation pathways, and we're now really keen to share these with you, the wider community, to make sure that we're on the right track before we start investing more time and resources and shaping these up any further. So that's really the purpose of our conversation today. The picture down the bottom of the slide is an example of what an adaptation pathway could look like. We call these metro map style diagrams, and they're not always the most intuitive or easy to understand. So I'm going to pass over to Tom, who's going to take you through just a kind of a quick explanation of some of the different key elements of these diagrams.
Cool. Good evening, everyone. So I'll get Crystal to start this video and I'll just talk you through some different parts of these different adaptation pathway diagrams. So to start out with, our work is about planning for the long term. So as you can see with this arrow here, we start out by just indicating that we're considering and planning for the next 100 years. I'll get you to click next bit, Crystal. So what this diagram is showing here is that in this case, this diagram is showing management options for a coastal road. So in this case, the grey line is the current management practices. So this would be council's current management interventions, so maintenance provisions around how we're dealing with impacts to a road. And what this diagram is showing is that the current maintenance option will serve us for perhaps the next 10 to 20 years in this case before the arrow goes down to another option. So I'll get you to flick through to the next bit, Crystal, just for half a moment. So what it's showing here from the grey down to the 2 different green lines is that we then have some sort of optionality or choices to make around what option we might move to. So in the case of this low-lying coastal road, this example, there would be an opportunity to potentially protect that road in that location through flood proofing and raising of that infrastructure out of the flood zone, or alternatively to move that road away from coastal hazards and rising seas. So there are choices about when you do these options and over what timescales. I'll get you to flick through to the end now, Crystal. So we then have some of these different symbols popping up on the diagram, and what these are is what we call signals, triggers, and thresholds. But for us tonight, really what these are just things that might happen in time that help inform council and the community's decisions to move from one option to another. So if you imagine us maintaining the road as we are currently, let's say, for example, along the Allandale area near the Allandale Hall, and as sea levels rise and flooding impacts increase, council might make a decision to move that road. So that rising seas might be the signal in this case, or perhaps the trigger to move to another option and make a choice to perhaps lift that road up or relocate that road away. And that dark line, that threshold, that's the sort of conditions that we'd like to avoid. For a road, it might be a certain number of road closures or impacts on the community, or a certain maintenance costs that we might want to avoid. So we'll move to the next slide now. Cool. So what we wanted to sort of touch on here is that when we're developing these different adaptation pathways for these different locations, so tonight we'll be talking about Rāpaki and then Allandale, and for different sort of assets. So for Rāpaki tonight, we'll be talking a bit about Gallipoli Wharf and then the local access track, and a bit about the local sort of shorefront car parking area as well. When we're thinking about these different assets, we have to consider a suite of different or a range of different adaptation options, and this is a list of them here. These are visible on our public webpage in our catalogue of coastal hazard adaptation options, which we'll link in the chat shortly. So yeah, the coastal panel and the specialist and technical advisory group that Ruby mentioned earlier have essentially gone through a process to consider each of these different options against a range of different criteria to help us make sure we're thinking about a broad range of different possibilities for each of these different locations. Yeah, we'll move on now. But we'll pass to Jane now for a moment. Sure. So we're just having a technical issue, so I'll take this slide now. So what we wanted to touch on here is that both Ruby and I have mentioned that we have a real focus on public assets through our process. So we've talked about roads and reserves, and tonight we'll talk about a bit about the Gallipoli Wharf too. But what we wanted to sort of just touch on here is that we also recognise that coastal hazards and sea level rise will impact perhaps many of you, the residents and ratepayers that live around Whakaropō and Kokararata Port Levy. So we just wanted to touch here on some of the things that we are trying to do to sort of support you as ratepayers and private property owners. So on the right hand side of the page, here are some of these different things. So the top right one is that recently we shared a letter drop to just under 100 different properties around Littleton Harbour and Port Levy. These were for property owners that were impacted with with around 20 centimetres of sea level rise. So to help people understand the risks that they might have from coastal hazards. We've also recently, which is on our webpage, developed a bit of a fact sheet for private property owners with some guidance around what you can do as individuals to manage your risks and the choices that you might have to adapt. And then lastly, what we wanted to mention is that there's a lot of work going on at the higher level in the central government space around this work, the select committee inquiry into what's called community-led retreat. So this is essentially about working through central government working through and trying to provide some better clarity around the process for moving at-risk communities away from coastal hazard locations, particularly where the risks are particularly high. So developing a bit of a process around that might wrap around and support communities to work through that. Cool, so I'll pass back to Crystal now, who's going to give an opportunity for some questions if there are any.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Tom and Ruby. And sorry for some technical difficulties there. We'll try and get Jane back online for the rest of the session. So we've got a chance now to answer any questions that you might have on the session so far. So anything on the background, you can pop those into the chat if you like. For the meantime, we did have a question emailed through earlier, so we'll ask the team that. This one's from Peter, and Peter said, why is the money collected from emissions taxes not being channeled into the building of dikes and seawalls? Tom, do you think you could answer that one for us?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I guess first thing to touch on here is just around sort of some roles and responsibility stuff. So while local government obviously collects local rates from our local ratepayers, we don't collect taxes per se. So this wouldn't be a responsibility of local government. Likely what you're talking about is more in that sort of emissions space is really more of a sort of central government responsibility. And yeah, there is definitely thinking around the sort of emitters pay, this sort of idea, but I really couldn't say too much more than that. Probably the other thing I would mention is that dikes and seawalls will be some of the options, some of the sort of protect options that might be available, but there would obviously also be other choices to reduce risks to at-risk locations that might involve living with the hazard or moving away from the hazard also.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. So it doesn't look like we've got any other questions so far, so we will crack on with the rest of the session. We're now going to move through and talk about Rāpaki and the draft adaptation pathways that we have there. So if you are waiting to see this section on Allandale, feel free to pop away for a cuppa and pop back in about 15 minutes or so. We will have a chance for further questions at the end of the Rāpaki section and at the end of Allandale. So if you missed your chance for a question there, just pop it in the chat and we'll get to it when we can.
Okay, great. So I guess again, for me, a little bit of upfront context. So late last year, we asked communities out in the Whakaropo and Kokorata areas to provide some input or feedback to us about what it is that they value about living in the area. So the Coastal Panel took this feedback, went away, turned them into community objectives that have been used in a number of ways to help guide this process to date. Crystal, if you flick to the next slide, some of the key feedback that we got from residents in the Rāpaki area was around the importance of assets like the Gallipoli Wharf and the walkway and the role that they play in helping to maintain access to the environment and that connection to both the land and the sea. So these are some of the key assets that we are focusing on in Rāpaki. I will pass over to Tom to take you through the draft pathways that we are looking at in this area.
Cool. Thank you, Ruby. Yeah, so before I sort of crack into the pathways and the options, just to touch on a bit of sort of upfront context about the Rāpaki area. I'm sure many of you know a lot about this place. You might live there or go there a lot, so we would, really appreciate your local insights as well. So just to start, in terms of coastal hazards, Rāpaki is a bit different to our other priority locations. It's not low-lying, it's on a fairly steep slope. So coastal erosion is, of the three hazards, the most relevant and the one that we're looking at most. Coastal flooding essentially is unlikely to impact this area due to the elevated land. So flooding is largely isolated to the beach, and rising groundwater also, because the land is significantly elevated, is not impacted by sea level, at least not to a significant degree. So what you're seeing on this page is the mapped coastal erosion extent. So this is taken from Christchurch City Council's Coastal Hazards portal, which is a publicly available web tool that you can use. So this brown area essentially represents the likelihood of coastal erosion under 40 centimetres of sea level rise, as you can see along the bottom of the page here. You can see that some of the areas, and these, just to clarify, these extents are based on sort of historical evidence of what erosion has occurred, and then we put on top of that the sea level rise projections, and that helps us understand how this bank, this coast might erode and destabilize and move and whatnot. So what you can see here is some of these areas are quite large, so we could have fairly significant impacts. And there are obviously a range of assets or things or places and spaces of value that could be impacted. So on the right hand side of our page, in that red line, you can see the walking track that winds from just east of the church towards the eastern beach, that sandy beach, and we recognise that this is a really valued access track to locals and people that come from further abroad to access this really valued and really nice beach down in the corner there. As we move west, we've also got, from a public asset perspective, we've got that car park down the front, which is well used and connects to that walking track. We've got the Gallipoli Wharf and boat ramp, which are used for a range of different reasons, recreational, and they also have a sort of lifeline function in emergencies. And then we've also got some wastewater infrastructure that council owns and manages, which services a number of local properties, around 10 of them, and the pipe is projected to be impacted by coastal erosion. So we're also wanting to plan for that. Lastly, on this slide, I'd also just want to flag that, be really upfront that we recognise that there are a range of places and spaces of value in Rāpaki that are not council owned but are very important. So that we're talking here about the church and the urupā and private property, which are also located close to the shoreline. Council is supporting Ngāti Wheki to plan for their spaces and places of value, but they're not things that we'll focus on this evening. Yeah, I'll get you to flick to the next slide, Crystal. So on the right-hand side of this page are the 4 public assets in Rāpaki that we are doing coastal adaptation planning for. So if you've seen any of our material online, you'll see that there's sort of a page for each of these public assets and a pathway. There's sort of option, that metro map that Ruby and I talked through earlier. But what I wanted to sort of do on this slide is just talk you through at a sort of higher level the kind of choices that council and the community might have to make around managing the space at Rāpaki and the public assets in this location more generally. So the option we have up the top is the hold the line option. So this is really about protecting public assets in the locations that they are. So sort of digging in, bedding in, building defences. I recognise that there are obviously existing rock walls, defences along the Rāpaki shorefront already, but there could also be extensions of those defences to the west and east to protect other spaces and public assets also. All these defences could be, upgraded to provide longer term protection as well. So that's a bit about the sort of holding the line option. There could obviously be other options that could support the rock wall, things like plantings and more nature-based options to sort of stabilise slopes and other things like that. Then we've got the more sort of natural, working with nature option or approach, as we've called it here. What this would involve more generally is moving away from the hazard in time. So we know that as rising seas occur, many of these public assets will be more expensive to maintain because tide levels will be raised more often and more frequently. And then when you pile storms on top of that, the impacts will become more severe, the coast will erode, and it will ultimately be a bit more challenging and expensive to retain those assets in that location. So this approach, working with nature, is about making choices to generally move away from coastal hazards and avoid sort of hard interventions in engineering that might have a negative environmental impact. If you flick to the next slide, Krista, I'll talk a bit more specifically about 2 of the assets. Yeah, cool. So what we've got here, this is just us sort of trying to preempt some of the assets that we felt might be of most interest. So I'll talk a bit about the Gallipoli Wharf in the first case here. So what's sort of shown on this pathway, and this is obviously the pathway that our coastal panel have pulled together and produced the feedback from the community, which is what this evening's about. So we're keen to have your feedback. What this pathway essentially says is that the existing Gallipoli Wharf is unlikely to be able to be maintained in its current state or sort of condition for much longer than sort of 10 to 15 years longer, as shown by the length of that grey line and the positioning of that threshold at the end of that grey line. At that point in time, there would then need to be a choice to move to a different option, which might involve raising, protecting and sort of increasing the resilience of Gallipoli Wharf, or perhaps building a more sort of modernised structure. We recognise that Gallipoli Wharf itself has real significant historic value for many people. So we recognise that option one, for some reasons, may be more popular, but also because it's an old wooden thing, it will be more difficult to retain for a long time than a shiny new structure. So yeah, that's sort of what's shown on this plot here. And then I'll just talk, if you go back, Crystal, sorry, I'll just talk slightly to, just our local, the beach access track. There's a few more choices here, so I'll just talk through some of those. So won't sort of linger on the detail, but again, you can see here, the maintain option only lasting for a period a bit longer than the Gallipoli Wharf is indicated, because the access track is a little bit further inland and unlikely to be impacted as soon as the wharf is. But then we then have options to potentially protect that walkway in that location, probably involving extending existing rock walls and armouring along the shorefront to mitigate or slow coastal erosion, or there could be choices to move the walkway and whatnot. Yes. But what I'll do now is I will pass back to Crystal. Obviously, this is an opportunity for you to all ask questions if you do on Rāpaki before we move on to Allandale, which is our next site.
Cool. Thanks for that, Tom. So we've had a few questions come through on the chat. They're probably more high-level questions. So if anyone does have any specific questions on Rāpaki, then please feel free to pop them in the chat now. While we're waiting, we will just ask some of these high-level questions. So there was a question here that says, is there any consideration of buying vulnerable properties to enable the owner to move to a new location, and then bowling the property to ensure that retreat from inundated areas can actually happen?
Kia ora koutou. Sorry, we're having some technical issues and I've had to jump onto Ruby's computer. There's some really good questions there from Professor Zero. And essentially what I believe you're asking about is managed retreat. The government has been talking for the last 2 or 3 years about introducing a new piece of legislation called the Climate Adaptation Act. And they didn't get to it. So the last government didn't get to it in the last term. So what has happened recently is the Select Committee are doing an inquiry into community-led retreat. That inquiry closed on the 1st of November, but essentially what they were looking for was feedback from the community about who should pay and how much should be paid, essentially to compensate private property owners for retreating from areas that are going to be at risk in the future. And so the council has put a submission forward onto that inquiry and made our view clear, which is that we really are looking for clarity sooner rather than later for private property owners, so that if retreat is essentially the direction in the area, then there is a way of them being able to get compensation for their property and move on and do exactly what you're suggesting, Professor Zero, which is to relocate elsewhere to a less at-risk area.
Perfect. Thank you, Jane. We have another question that's sort of related to that. So if you want to stay online for this one, are there any areas that are affected that are already starting to get issues with insurance?
We know from the work we've done with the Insurance Council that there will be some reduction of cover, perhaps partial cover or insurance retreat in some areas around the country. Insurers don't tend to publish their data sets, so there isn't a publicly available data set whereby we could find out which areas insurance retreat is occurring, and council doesn't collect that data from insurers either. So I think there's a bit of a gap in terms of all of our understanding of the insurance coverage across the country. And so that's something we are keeping an eye on. We have some information for private property owners about insurance on our website, so please do jump on and have a look at our fact sheet if that's of use for you.
Cool. And just so everyone knows, that fact sheet we've also popped into the chat. So if you would like to have a look at it, you can click on it through there. So one last question for now, by the looks of it. And it was a follow-up to the question that Tom answered before. So it is, could the council not approach government for emissions tax funding for mitigation projects?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to take this, but admittedly, it's really in the same space that Jane's touched on. Again, because local government lacks that clarity around the Climate Adaptation Act, and at the moment, our process is very much focused on public assets, and without central government coming in and giving the direction around how we might support communities to move away from these locations or otherwise adapt, as you've indicated. Council ultimately doesn't have that responsibility, but if that legislation was to go into place, that would be the opportunity for groups like Christchurch City Council to potentially advocate up for their communities and try and secure funding to undergo adaptation or to support local communities and private landowners.
Thanks, Tom. Awesome. So that brings us to the end of the Rāpaki section. We'll now move through to talk about Allandale. And again, time for questions at the end. So please pop those in the chat when you've got them.
Awesome. So upfront context for Allandale. Access is actually also a big topic in Allandale, particularly access to the environment. Residents spoke a lot about the importance of maintaining and enhancing the natural environment and have valued assets like the domain, the foreshore track, the Governor's Bay jetty and the beaches were for helping to provide that access. And so again, those are some of the key assets that we're focusing on in Allandale. And like Tom mentioned earlier, you are the residents and you guys know these places best. So if throughout the night there are assets that we don't talk about, public assets that we don't talk about, then we're always keen to hear about things that are of importance to you. So definitely reach out and get in touch. But otherwise, I will pass over to Tom.
Cool. It's actually flicked to the next one for me. Crystal, if you can. Ruby's touched on this stuff. Yeah. Cool. So what we want to sort of touch on here, because Allandale has a number of different assets, actually 5 that we've looked at with the coastal panel and the specialist and technical advisory group. So they're the road, a small section of road that's actually visible in this these historic images. Then we've got the Allandale Hall, we've got the domain, the reserve, we've got the local access track between Allandale and Governor's Bay, which is part of that broader head-to-head walking route. And then the focus of this slide, the historic landfill or dump. And what we want to sort of touch on here, because we weren't sort of so aware of how much awareness there might be with some of the attendees about the sort of history of this site. So I won't go into major detail, but we just thought it would be worthwhile sort of touching on it. So this top left image here is showing the the section of Allandale near the road pre-landfill. So what you can see is that the shoreline was obviously significantly further inland, and then what you can see in the subsequent photos is the progressive infilling on top of the mudflat, which would have, it's essentially household waste that was dumped on this site seaward of the road, and it's essentially 40,000 cubic metres of household waste in this location, a really substantial amount of waste, which has essentially forced a substantial land reclamation on top of an ecologically significant mud flat, so a big sort of environmental loss. And a real sort of focus of our work here is thinking about, well, what's the best way to sort of manage the risk to this contaminated site going forwards? Is it to protect it or move it or whatnot? So I'll talk a bit more about that in a few slides time, but we just wanted to just give some of that context up front about sort of what lies beneath it, Allandale. Yeah, I'll get you to flick to the next one, Crystal. Cool. So like Rāpaki, we just wanted to touch on a bit about the hazards in Allandale and the sort of assets that are at risk. So I've touched on the assets, but just to talk a bit about the sort of hazards. In Rāpaki, it was all about erosion. In Allandale, to be quite frank, it's kind of about all three of them. Erosion's a real risk for the shorefront assets, particularly for the walkway and for the landfill. But as you can see by this fairly large blue area, coastal flooding and rising groundwater are also significant issues because Allandale is really flat. If people have played sports on this field, for example, you'll know that in winter it's not so hot, and increasingly it's a really damp environment, quite sort of unmanageable. The hall itself also has some issues that stem from quite high groundwater and moisture related issues, so that building's suffered from the location that it resides within. And I guess all else here to sort of touch on is the image on the right, which obviously we have a large stretch of walkway that stretches between Allandale and Governor's Bay, large parts of it of which are already defended, so rock wall and other sort of concrete sections that provide a sort of variable level of protection to that walkway, which is really, we appreciate, is very well loved by this community. So there's a real focus of our work in thinking about, how can that asset be managed? Can it be protected in that site long term? What might that cost? Or could it possibly be relocated inland to provide an access track, albeit of a different nature, in a perhaps more suitable location? So yeah, Crystal, you can flick to the next one. Cool. So a bit more about what's been sort of proposed by the coastal panel put forward in these draft pathways. So again, just to touch, in Allandale, we're focusing on 5 different public assets, so it gets a bit sort of messy. We've got, as I mentioned, the historic landfill, that foreshore track, the Allandale Hall, the Governor's Bay to Teddington Road, and then the Allandale Domain, or the large area of reserve. Again here, like in Rāpaki, the options can sort of broadly be categorised into these 2 different approaches. So holding the line would again largely involve protecting these assets in their existing location. So for the walkway, it would likely involve upgrading and upsizing of the rock wall to retain that asset in that location, which might only be feasible for a period, but could be done for at a cost. The same thing for the landfill. There's obviously existing defences in front of that landfill, but they'll need to be upgraded in time to reduce risk of contaminants being washed into the harbour, which is obviously something that we would want to avoid and need to avoid. And then we've got obviously the reserve as well, the Allandale Hall and Governor's Bay. So in terms of the holding the line approach for the road, that would largely involve raising flood-prone sections of it, or otherwise making it more flood-proof, so more resilient to increasing frequency of flooding, so surface water on it and whatnot. And then we've got the Allandale Hall. So the key pit for this in terms of holding the line for the Allandale Hall, that would quite possibly need to involve substantial investment to alleviate some of the existing moisture related issues. So not to go into too much of a rabbit hole, but if you're not aware, the current Allandale Hall has a range of moisture related issues that have led to significant moisture and mold underneath the floorboards and in some of the wall sections, and council and the community board and local reserve committee have been thinking about what it might cost to buy a bit of time and address some of these issues, but they'll only work for so long, as you saw with those flood maps. It's not an ideal location for an old wooden structure like this, so there's some challenging decisions to be made around the future of that hall as well, which you can obviously see online in our adaptation pathways document. Crystal, I'll get you to move on to the next one now. Oh, sorry, I've said that and then I've remembered I didn't touch it. I'll get you to flick back. Sorry, that's my fault. I didn't touch on the working with nature option here, so I'll just sort of give some examples in relation to some of these assets. So the working with nature option, as I mentioned for the Rāpaki talk, was more about moving away from the hazards. So when we talk about the Allandale landfill, this would likely involve essentially excavating and removal of this site, likely taking this contaminated material to a site like Cape Valley, which is obviously many kilometres away, so a significant cost to the rate base, but that would obviously address the risk of contamination to the harbour and solve that issue long term. Working with nature for some of these other assets, again, would involve maybe moving or rerouting sections of the road, or even removing or closing the facility at Allandale Hall. So again, some big choices. The working with nature option is more about moving away, as I've sort of touched on. So we'll work through some of the pathways now on the next slide. Cool. Yeah, so just wanted to touch on some of these now, and I guess just to remind you all that our online material does include indicative costings for these different pathways, which might be of interest and help you sort of give feedback on what you think would be best. So when we talk about this Allandale landfill pathway here, we've got the maintain option working for a period of say 10 to 20 years because it's got existing defences, so it's not at significant risk right now, but in time those defences will degrade and there'll need to be choices about upgrading them or moving the landfill away. So that's ultimately what the green and sort of moss coloured lines show in the pathway map below, that we could armour the landfill and protect it for a period, or remove the landfill and sort of solve the issue long term. Just to touch on some of the possible costs for these kind of options, we have got some indicative costings on this, and to armour this landfill with a more substantive rock wall, it's in the sort of low millions, so just shy of the $2 million mark to install a significantly larger defence along that shore front, which we know would have impact on the mud flats. Or alternatively, the removal of the landfill is in the sort of many tens of millions of dollars, near that sort of $50 to $70 million mark. And that estimate's based on councils removed other landfills at places like the Bonds Bay, which helps us sort of learn and understand what it might cost to do it here. And obviously we know how much contaminants is in Allandale landfill, that 40,000 cubic metres. So yeah, some big costs and big challenges here. And then we'll move to the walkway one. So a few more sort of choices here, a bit more sort of optionality. Again, the maintain option is shown to sort of function for a period before there's some available choices to flood-proof and protect that walkway, which is that sort of holding the line option, which is unlikely to be feasible forever. or the sort of moss-coloured line, which is that move the walkway inland, very steep inland location, obviously. So if the walkway was to go there, I would suggest it's likely that it would be at a sort of lower level of service. It wouldn't be as sort of flat or wider access track, so it might not be accessible to the same sort of group or sort of demographic as the current access way is. So recognise that that could be non-ideal. And then the bottom line is the essentially a closure. So what I would say is that the most likely way for an option like that to come about, which is obviously yet to be determined and all that, would be through essentially the existing location of the walkway might become sort of untenable or so expensive to maintain. Council could go through a significant process to look at that, moving the access way inland, and through that investigation might find that it could be particularly challenging or simply not workable from a cost. It might be prohibitively expensive as well. So then we want to keep our options open in terms of possible closure. Yeah, so I think that's probably all I'll sort of touch on for now. I'll pass back to Crystal, and very happy to, I guess last things for me, very happy to answer some questions. And second, I know Crystal's can do this, but also love to get you guys online giving feedback about this stuff. So really appreciate you coming along, giving feedback. But the best thing you can do if you've got strong feelings about this is jump online and tell us what you think. So appreciate your time. Thank you.
Cool, thank you, Tom, and really couldn't have said it better myself. So we'll pause now for questions on the Allandale section. So I'll just give a minute or so. If you've got a question, please pop it into the chat now.
I just see Peter's followed up the follow-up. So I don't think I can give a too direct an answer to that, Peter, but if you do want to share something, we're very happy to take it offline and provide something over email. But yeah, I think you got some good thinking there, and very happy to provide an email after this.
Okay, so we have a question that's come through that has asked, where did you get the data and the evidence regarding predictions for sea level rise? Tom, do you want to jump in for that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Yeah, so this is a good question, and one we get often, so very happy to take this. So essentially, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is this big group of international scientists, come together every several years and review the leading science on climate and coastal science, things like ice sheet melting and thermal expansion, so the warming of the oceans and how that contributes to sea level rise. And they come up with a range of what we call sea level rise projections, and then they essentially push these out and sort of indicate that these are some of the possible futures or different sea level rise projections that we might see in the future. And then groups like the Ministry for the Environment in New Zealand then have a responsibility to take that information, localise it, and then give it out to local governments, so groups like Christchurch City Council. So that's essentially what's happened here. We get these sea level rise projections from IPCC through to MFE, who localise them. We then receive them, and then through our work, we essentially plan against the sort of full range of possible futures that might occur. So when I talk about these projections, in the next 30 years, we could see as little as sort of around 10 to 13 centimetres of sea level rise, or as much as sort of 23 to 25 centimetres of sea level rise. So that's just to give an indication of the sort of possible band or range of sea level rise that we could see. We don't know exactly how much it's going to go up. We know it is going to go up. That's sort of irrefutable. The evidence is there. Even if we stopped emitting today as a society, there's a the climate system takes a while to respond to that, so there'd be a sort of lag in the climate system, so sea levels will continue to rise irrespective of what people do, at least for a couple of decades, but largely they depend long term on us and society and the choices we make to emit greenhouse gases or not. Last thing I would touch on, just locally here, I've talked about the projections. We also use the Lyttelton Ports sea level rise data, so they have the second or first longest standing sea level rise record in the country, dates back to the early 1900s, and over that time frame we can see around 30 centimetres of sea level rise over that time frame, which has accelerated more recently. So that's also evidence we use of historic data. So we mix all that stuff together.
Awesome, thanks for that, Tom. So we will just move on now. If you've got any further questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to email them through to our email address, and then we can answer those for you. So that'll pop up on the next slide for you. But like Tom said earlier, it is really important that we get the wider public's feedback. The Coastal Panel, obviously, community representatives who've done their best to try and represent your views, but it is really important for you to feedback into them and help them figure out whether they're on the right track with these draft pathways. So you can find out more information about each of the pathways for Rāpaki, Allandale and the other priority locations that we're looking at online at letstalk.ccc.govt.nz. So you can provide feedback to us on this part of the project by until the 10th of December this year. So please go ahead and have a look at that and let us know what you think. So we've now reached the end of our presentation. Thanks everyone for taking time out of your busy lives to join us tonight. It's been really great to have you. If you've got any feedback on the session or you've got more questions or comments about the project, please contact us. The details are on the slide for you now. So you can email us at letstalk@ccc.govt.nz, or you can give me a call on 03941 8096. We also have some other webinars that you may wish to attend coming up. So next Wednesday, the 15th of November, we'll do a webinar on Teddington and Charteris Bay. And then on Tuesday, the 21st of November, we will do one for Puro and Kokararata. So thanks again from myself and all of our team. Enjoy the rest of your evening.